Welcome, I'm Charles Shapiro, the President of World Affairs Council. Today's program is with former Chief of Protocol Capricia Marshall, the author of Protocol, The Power of Diplomacy and How to Make It Work for You. This program is brought to you by the members of the World Affairs Council. And I want to welcome in particular, I've got 4 of our board members on the call: Clyde Tuggle, Gordon Giffen, Partner Denton's, Jim Reed, CEO of YKK North America, and Dr. Jagdish Seth from the Koizweta School of Business at Emory. But we also have the Consuls General of Brazil, Canada, and Israel, and Nico Weinberg, who's the Chief of Protocol for the state of Georgia, Vanessa Ibarra, who's the Director of the City of Atlanta Office of International Affairs, and Lee Zack, President of Agnes Scott College. Clyde is a founding member of the board of the World Affairs Council and a former chair. And Clyde, I'm going to turn this over to you to introduce Capricia.
Great. Charles, thank you. And I'd also like to add a warm welcome to everybody who was able to join us today. Lots of dear friends on this one, so it's going to be fun. And let me welcome you, Capricia, Ambassador Marshall, to the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. We like to think that we are the best World Affairs Council in the network of World Affairs Councils in the U.S. and we are distinguished to be certainly one of the largest ones. I've known you, Capricia, for gosh, how long? It's been many years. Let's not count all of them. But Capricia, let me start just by saying, really is the American dream in so many ways. She grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Her father was Croatian, her mother was Mexican. She distinguished herself academically at Purdue and then later at Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and had an extraordinary political career. And it's a story that really starts in many ways at the very bottom, working on campaigns for President Clinton. Probably in the day when nobody thought that governor from Arkansas had a shot at being elected president, rising through the ranks, and really eventually becoming one of the really inner circle of advisors for both President Bill Clinton and Secretary Hillary Clinton. She distinguished herself during the Clinton administration, rising to be the Deputy Assistant to the President and the White House Social Secretary. Then in between, went off and did a number of interesting things. That's actually at the point where she and I crossed paths, and she did some consulting work for Coca-Cola, and then went back in to the Obama administration, eventually rising as the U.S. Chief of Protocol. And in many ways, the way I describe Capricia, in addition to being one of the most civilized people I know, is that she is a wonderful representative and spokesperson for the United States, and really embodies what the idea of being a diplomat is. And this book, which is full of wonderful stories about how important protocol is to the diplomatic arena, for me, speaks especially to this idea of commercial diplomacy. Because I feel like all the years, and Capricia, you were a wonderful coach and guide to me as we tried to figure out how this global entity called Coca-Cola moving around the world could execute as much a diplomatic agenda as a commercial agenda. And in fact, we couldn't execute our commercial agenda unless we understood how to behave, to act, to operate in a diplomatic fashion. And in so many ways, your book is a guide for anybody who is in business, and particularly anybody who is in business in the international arena, because these skills, these diplomatic skills, are at the core, I think, of what makes a great salesperson. So you honor us today by being here. We thank you for your distinguished service to our country. We know you're not finished. You're still very young. You've got a long way to go. And we look forward to hearing your stories and what's behind this extraordinary book. So thank you for being here.
Well, my goodness, I am incredibly flattered, my friend. Thank you so very much for that extraordinary introduction. And I'm assuming it's not only because I prominently featured you in the book. But thank you so very much, Clyde, and thank you also for extending the opportunity to me through the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. I would agree with you. It's probably one of the finest in the nation, and it's such a pleasure to join you, Charles. I'm now a fan of watching your programming, as you have interviewed so many interesting people throughout this quite fascinating summer. And as well, I'm just beyond excited to be joined with so many friends from Atlanta, Ambassador Giffen, and protocol officers extraordinaire. It's going to be wonderful to connect with you, and please do reach back out to me after our chat on either Twitter or Instagram. But thank you so very much for the opportunity, Charles.
Well, thank you for taking the time to do this. I'm going to ask you some questions, and then we're going to move to questions from the audience. So everybody in the audience, please use the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you'll see there's a Q&A function there, and send me the questions, but you have to make them short, because I got to read them and think at the same time, and the shorter, the better for me. So Ambassador Marshall, let me just start off. For so many people, protocol sounds like formality and rules and figuring out which fork to use and uncomfortable shoes. Is that fair? Is that what protocol is about?
No, actually, it's quite interesting. The word itself, protocol, seems to be off-putting to so many people. They're just not quite sure what does protocol want you to do? What does it stand for? How does it help you? And oftentimes people think that it's crystal chandeliers and gold gilded flatware and things of that sort, and it couldn't be farther from the truth. Protocol really sets the stage. It puts the wheels in motion for diplomacy. It creates, what we did in the Office of Protocol was we created a roadmap for the interactions, both big and small, with the global leaders. I did that for President Obama and Secretary Clinton on a daily basis. We created a foundation for diplomacy, and that foundation then allows them to conduct the business at hand, to put forth his foreign policy agenda in the manner in which he had hoped to do.
Why can't whether it's political leaders or business leaders or national leaders, how come they just can't sit down and talk? What's the role of protocol in enabling those people to talk to each other?
Well, I always considered protocol a superpower, because there are many minor details that once put all together can create this major impact. People don't really know that before the president walked into a room that we had selected that room. We had put the table that would fit in that room. You know, I can tell you a quick example of one. When President Obama traveled to Mexico for the G20, tensions were really high because he was about to have a bilateral with President Putin. And this was the first bilateral that they were going to have while President Putin just regained the presidency. So there was a lot on the agenda. The NSC had informed me, gave me a quick snippet of what was going to happen on the agenda. And it really helped us as protocol officers then to determine, how do we set that stage? From the physical arrangements, you know, where am I going to greet him? Where will I be escorting him? How will that greeting take place? What's in the room? What does the lighting look like? What is the table size? Are there flowers on the table? Down to the size of that room, making sure that it was in a way that would push the conversation in the direction of the president. We chose a particularly small room for this engagement because we wanted to force President Putin to really come to the table and make decisions, to come together, close that gap between he and President Obama. So when he arrived, he was a little late, unfortunately. I escorted him down. And there's also something called the mindset of diplomacy. We want to put our leaders leaders in sort of the driver's seat. We want them to have the favor. We're trying to pivot the power in our direction. So he wasn't expecting certain members of the U.S. delegation to be there, and one of them certainly was Secretary Clinton. They were a little bit at odds with one another. Well, President Obama stood there, and he's, you know, a very tall 6-foot+ person, and Secretary Clinton was standing behind him, and he unveiled her presence. Then, like a hint of a moment, President Putin was taken aback by the fact that she was there. And so we now have a mindset set. We knew that our roadmap worked that day because they emerged from that very confined room a little closer in many of those decision points that they had to make that day.
How do we, you know, if we're not the White House or the State Department or Coca-Cola, but a business or a World Affairs Council meeting with potential corporate members, how do we use diplomacy? How do we make diplomacy work for us?
Oh my! So that's actually why I wrote the book. When I departed the White House, I realized that people were having a really hard time making those critical connections and developing relationships that that would assist them in their ultimate goals, whether it was in business or in their personal life. And what I realized was that I've been doing this for, you know, over 12 years for 2 presidents, multiple secretaries of state, first ladies, and vice presidents. And so I wanted to put those lessons and tools to work for those communities. In the business community, first off, you know, realizing what is your business ethos and how am I developing that? How am I showcasing it in the same way that I did in government and talking about who we are as America? A business needs to do that same, it needs to exercise that same attempt. You know, how do I brand my business? Next is investing in relationships is so important. We realized in the Office of Protocol that diplomacy is a long game. You take a lot of steps to create that relationship and invest in that relationship. And one way of doing that, of course, is through respect. Showcasing those respectful ways in which you engage in that relationship. I often use soft power tools to use to help exhibit respect, to create a foundation in that relationship, whether it was through food or through language, the power of place, like I just discussed in the G20 in Mexico. I use the Oval Office to my advantage. What's the CEO's office? How does that CEO's office operate as a benefit to that company? Is it a special place reserved only for the signing and sealing of the deal? All of those elements then together create a trust between these two people, these two individuals. And once you've created that trusting relationship, you can conduct the business and pretty assured that you're going to achieve those goals that you had set forth.
What do you mean by soft power?
Oh, well, soft power, a term coined by Joe Nye,
right.
Is one of those, it's an influencer, as opposed to it being coercive, you know, like hard power is. We're not using military or economic might. What we're doing is we're trying to attract people into our way of thinking. And we use a variety of tools in which to do that. Like I said, through food. I launched the culinary diplomacy effort at the Office of Protocol. We use chefs and in creating these bridges of understanding between us and our counterparts. I used language. I used gifts. Gifts is an enormous soft power tool that I think the business community does not take full advantage of. That crystal paperweight is not going to cut it. What you want to do is use that opportunity at the end of a meeting to punctuate it, to give them something that is reflective of the effort between the two of you. Where are you heading in this relationship? Well, when you seal that deal, you know, really make it matter when you give them something that's special. Those are the types of influencers, attractors that help you bridge a relationship and then persuade or attract them to your perspective.
I want you to know that Clyde Tuggle gave me a Coca-Cola can with my name on it after I finished meeting with him.
Pretty good. Pretty good. gift.
Actually, I'm not so sure, but I thought it was great. I thought it was great. Why? I mean, in my diplomatic career, I always found that having a meal together with somebody was just so important. And I mean, what are your views on that? I mean, why is that? Why does that break barriers between people sitting down and eating together?
There are so many elements involved in a meal and the effect of having that meal together. That's right. You're literally breaking bread with one another at the table. You know, early on in the administration, I had set forth a bilateral luncheon between Secretary Clinton and one of her counterparts. And when the meal was put before her, she sort of looked down at it. She looked up at me. She looked back down at it. And I got the point. We can do better. That food, that moment was another element in this discussion, in this negotiation, in bringing them closer together. What she wanted our food to say is, you know, this is who we are as Americans. Now, the boiled chicken and the rice and some limp vegetables certainly was not sending that message. We could do better. Hence, I launched the culinary diplomacy program. And in that, then, we brought in these amazing chefs. We brought in Ming Tsai from Boston, fantastic chef, when we were first hosting then Vice President Xi Jinping. And I recall the moment so fondly when I was escorting then Vice President Xi into the room to meet with Vice President Biden and Secretary Clinton, and she was standing next to Ming Tsai. And when we made the introductions, literally his eyes lit up. The Vice President Xi's eyes lit up. He was so taken by the fact that we had brought in this very famous chef of Chinese ancestry to make this very special meal for him. We did so much in that instant for the relationship, the beginning of this new relationship between the United States and soon to become President Xi, than probably any bilateral discussion could do.
Wow, that's something. When both in commercial diplomacy and in international diplomacy, I mean, people have traveled long distances. They're in the wrong time zone. You know, they've just gotten off the plane and they're when they ought to be sleeping, and suddenly they're supposed to be awake. How do you deal with that? And I'm sure you've got, you know, loads of stories of where that's gone wrong. We all remember President George W. Bush getting ill at a huge banquet in Tokyo. I mean, how do you deal with that when people are just tired, or the Pope falls asleep in a meeting? How do you deal with that when you're the chief of protocol?
Well, it is not easy. You're absolutely right. You know, we did travel on long distances. I went with the president. The position of chief of protocol, you are connected at the hip of the president. And for any foreign visitor that came to the United States, and when he traveled abroad, I was with him on absolutely every stop, no matter where he went, every bilateral meeting, every dinner, every breakfast. So when we landed, oftentimes the entire crew, except for him, the Secret Service, and myself, would head to the hotel. The few of us then would head off to a late night engagement. And so you had to learn first off to sleep on a plane well, but it was also my job to make sure that, you know, the president not only knew those cultural IQ issues. I wanted him to be aware of specific greetings. I wanted him to, again, that's giving him a little bit of an advantage, but also helping him make these critical connections. But I do recall him nodding off a few times, and I would have to be nearby to give a little shake to make sure that, you know, he was a part of that discussion and engaging. You know, he was pretty good at this because he was a younger man and held his own. But sure, you know, as leaders travel the world, they certainly do have those issues that they have to deal with.
What's the biggest faux pas that you? I'll ask some questions, and hopefully you can give us a shorter version of the incident. But what's the biggest faux pas that you, obviously you didn't commit, but that you ran into in your years as chief of protocol?
Well, I may not have actually committed, but I accepted full responsibility for that. And as the head of the office, that's what you do. On this one occasion at the UN General Assembly, when President Obama added on not only the many, many, many meetings that we were having, bilateral meetings that we were having with his counterparts around the world in New York City at the Waldorf Astoria, but he also decided to host the meeting of ASEAN leaders. And there we were required to set the stage. Part of that was posting flags. Well, someone in the office had delegated away our duty on flagging because we had so much going on. Not an excuse, an explanation. And as I finished escorting the leaders out onto the stage for them to be seated in front of their flags, one of the protocol officers came running up to me, flustered, and she does not fluster easy at all. She said, "We have a huge problem. The flag of the Philippines was hung inappropriately, and in hanging what it did, it's that it not only offended them because of course it's hung inappropriately, but it also happened to indicate that the Philippines was at war in the manner it was hung. So we really did have a problem." And so immediately I directed, team, we have to correct that very quickly. And then after we did that, I certainly had to step forward and make those apologies. And I did not roll that bus under anyone. I took the hit completely and went to the ambassador and then had to post something very publicly stating that I was so very sorry. What I also didn't know was that President Obama was about to have a pull aside on the fly with the president of the Philippines. So I also had to face the music with my leader, and who is wonderful on all occasions, but at this moment, quite serious, looked down at me and asked me, "Capricia," he goes, "I understand, but this is never going to happen again." And I assured him that it would not, and it did not.
No, sir, absolutely not. What's the biggest cultural misunderstanding that you encountered? I mean, it's such a hard thing in business. It's a hard thing in diplomacy where you think you're saying one thing, your counterpart takes it a different way, or you serve food in a way that's offensive to them. I mean, all those cultural cues that are so darn hard to understand.
They are, and that's why it's really important, and I emphasize this quite a bit in the book, to do your research, do your homework before you engage with someone from a different culture. Know the different types of greetings, in particular if you're in their country, their rules. When you know these proper cultural cues, you can create the connection you're trying to create. And of course it conveys respect, but it legitimizes you as someone who is worthwhile to negotiate with, someone who they want to continue to have a relationship with. So understanding if, in particularly when you're a woman, it's really important to know the gender cultural IQs, that there are some men from certain religious sects that will not touch women. Don't be offended by it, but understand that if they've crossed their hands in front of them, they're trying to be very polite and convey to you, this is not a way that I engage. And to know that gives you a certain advantage.
Who is the most difficult? Obviously not on our side, but I assume there are people that are easier to deal with, or their staffs are easier to deal with, and there are people who are difficult to deal with. What's the most difficult country or leader to deal with in your experience?
Now, Charles, that would be not very diplomatic of me to call anyone out. But I would say that there are countries that have a stricter adherence to protocol. And so you really have to make sure that things are as buttoned up as possibly can be. And it is oftentimes a game. I mean, you want to put your president, your leader, in the best position. You want to put your CEO in the best position that you possibly can. You want to give them the full advantage. And so when your counterpart is using all their tools and really going at it, you have to make sure that you're on top of your game. And I would say that you probably the Chinese are incredibly good at doing this. Very, very good. There's usually nothing that is left to surprise. It's very well laid out, but you have to stay on your game because sometimes they'll throw you something on the side that you weren't quite prepared for. And that's when nimbleness, flexibility in protocol really comes into play. Because what protocol gives you, it's being fully prepared for every engagement. And when you are so fully prepared, you are influencing that engagement. You're also very optimistic in attaining your goals. And like I said, it offers you the opportunity for spontaneity, to be nimble, and it completely eliminates all of the stress associated with that engagement.
Since March, all of us have been doing more and more by Zoom and electronic means as opposed to face-to-face meetings. And I saw the Irish ambassador to Washington in the Washington Post said, diplomacy is a face-to-face profession. What's the role of protocol when you're meeting virtually and not in person? How does that work? Or is it harder or easier?
Well, it's quite interesting. I was just engaging in a conversation with the ambassador of Singapore about this very issue, and it is he stated to me, I would have thought that it may have lent itself to being a little easier because as you point out, Charles, that you're in your own time zone, so you're not traveling somewhere else, that you don't have to deal with the jet lag and the hours of travel and the wear and tear on you. But he said that because he is now able to have back-to-back meetings, it's not allowing him that time where he can be reflective and also act on the discussion that he had just had. In diplomacy, a lot of what these ambassadors are doing is that, and leaders, of course, they have to have that engagement, but then you have to be reflective on it. What's happening is that people are scheduling back-to-back Zooms. And so you're moving from one topic to the next and one issue to the next. And people think that we can manage more because you're just sitting in your living room or you're just sitting in your kitchen. It's not necessarily the case. It's that diplomacy is a long game. And so it takes a lot to nurture that last engagement. What am I going to do to carry it forward? And we're not affording ourselves that time in which to do so. So I thought that was a very interesting point that he made. And I think that can be applicable to everyone, in business as well. We're trying to get more done in a shorter period of time. And the virtual setting is a little harried and chaotic unless you do block out. You're a master scheduler and can give yourself that time to be reflective right after your last engagement.
Let's go to some questions from the audience, some of which I'm going to skip because they're like, wasn't Ambassador so-and-so a dope and doing this, that, or the other? And so I'm going to skip some of those. But here's a good one from Lauren Lang. What advice would you give for people who want to start a career in protocol?
Oh, that's a great one.
How do you get into it? I mean, it's a business. How do you get into this business?
Well,
first thing is buy your book.
Yes, absolutely. First, buy the book, because there's so many wonderful lessons and tools in there that will make you shoot straight up to the top of the list of anyone hiring. But I do advise people to really consider the Foreign Service and the Civil Service of the State Department. There are wonderful entry points in the Civil Service, and the Foreign Service. Taking the exam, is a challenge. But it's certainly, once you have, there's so many opportunities that are open to you. And I have great reverence for those who have served our government, both in the Foreign Service and Civil Service. They have dedicated their lives to the foreign policy goals, no matter the administration, no matter the political party in power, to the continued effort in our engagements around the world. So those are wonderful ways at finding a place. And you are then veered to. Working for me in the Office of Protocol, the Chief of Protocol is a political appointed position. So you don't rise from the ranks to receive this position. You are appointed, you are named and appointed by the President of the United States. But serving in the Office of Protocol alongside with me, I think about 60% were from were career officers.
That's fascinating. Here's a question from Dr. Jagdish Sheth. What's the future of the U.S.-India relationship, no matter what the outcome of the U.S. election is in November? I mean, how do you see that moving forward? And what role does protocol, have you seen protocol play as our relationship with India has improved so much since 1990?
Well, we are in some challenging times right now. The Prime Minister has a very, Prime Minister Modi has his own challenges in his country, and the engagement with the U.S. is oftentimes met with some barricades. And I was quite lucky during my time with President Obama that when we worked in India, both there and when we welcomed them to the United States, those engagements were friendly. It was two leaders who on the global stage had a lot at stake. And I worked really closely with my counterparts in developing these extraordinary state visits. We went there, and we were, of course, invited by the president of India, and also engaged with Prime Minister Singh, who was fantastic, and walk through a way in which we could surmount some of those obstacles along the way. I'm hopeful that through time and when we're able to get back together again, you noted earlier the struggle that we're having in our diplomatic engagements through this virtual manner of meeting. There is nothing that can ever replace the face-to-face. You get a sense of a person, you get a real read on them, you understand. There's this sort of mindset that I discuss in the book called thin slicing. The moment you meet someone, you get a feeling for, are they with me or are they not? Are they someone that I feel as though I can trust and move forward with or not? There's this just feeling that you have, and the virtual space does not allow that to happen. So I am hopeful that when we get back to time that we are meeting again, our president with their prime minister face to face, that we'll be able to forge that relationship forward again.
Now here's the most delicate question of the day, and it has to do with family diplomacy. If your family is like everybody else's, asked Leslie, when you get together for Thanksgiving, you've got a whole bunch of people with different views on what's going on in our country right now, as we're so polarized. How do you engage your diplomatic skills when you're dealing with the uncle who thinks you're just absolutely wrong, but you've got to get through that family, whether it's Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever?
Well, what diplomacy, one of the biggest tenets, the major tenets of diplomacy is being open to discussion, because you're trying to create that bridge in the relationship. And you cannot create a bridge if you're putting up your own wall and obstacles on your own personal perspective and viewpoints. I, like so many others in my family, have people who have very different ideas about the political process, about this time of the pandemic, on the struggles that we are now experiencing again through the protests that have happened. All of these issues that have come to the surface, and that we are all trying to manage manage in a way that helps us gain some clarity. And that's what protocol actually does. It sort of removes the fog from these unclear times, and gives you a sort of a set structure. And within that set structure is having an open mind to those discussions and the viewpoints of others, because perhaps, just perhaps, you might hear something, learn something that you hadn't thought of before, and that you can begin to adopt. We are born with presets. These presets come from our background, our religion, our economic level, our education level. And unless we're willing to acknowledge what our presets are and then be open to changing those presets, we're going to be very dull individuals. You just become a more enhanced person when you have that open mindset. In diplomacy, for the president, in his leadership skills, which I found just fantastic with both President Clinton and President Obama, was that they didn't lead through decision enforcing matters. It wasn't about being strong. Everyone knows the President of the United States is strong. They found that by using empathy and humility, they gained so much ground by putting themselves into the position of the person, their counterpart, gave them a strength otherwise not really available in using the more decisive methods. So it's interesting in these times, and so perhaps we just need to become a bit more empathetic and really embrace humility, so that we can get through these family gatherings together. And in the end, maybe we'll have a more collaborative experience.
I'm writing this down because I've got some issues in my family. I need to, we're having a hard time. Sandy Gruskin asks, he says he was living in Paris when President Obama visited, and that people were, I don't know how widespread this is, are upset because Michelle Obama brought her own hairdresser, or, you've got somebody to taste the food. I mean, how do you, when you're traveling with the president and the first family, and you're trying, obviously, you've got to keep them comfortable. I mean, are there things that you shouldn't do? How do you deal with that? The perception that the United States is big and overbearing and ignoring the beauties of the country that you're visiting.
Well, I fondly remember that trip, and thought that I was, I guess I may have missed those points that were made after the trip, because I just remember the streets being lined with people, and they were so excited to see the president and Mrs. Obama. And we did make sure that you try really hard to avoid offenses. That is also why protocol is so very important. If you know and lay out the expectations, you certainly can avoid those potholes and the blunders along the way. And if you do offend, immediately making the apology. There certainly, I'm sure, was no intention at all by Mrs. Obama traveling with whom she did. I mean, there are security measures that are involved when you are at that level, and you have to abide by those security measures. Can I say, Charles, one thing that's off of the question that's
Sure.
not with the question, because I do want to make sure that I talk about this just a little bit, because it was so special to me during my time as chief of protocol. There was a program that I created called, it was a program that I adopted from my predecessor and then expanded, actually. It's called Experience America. Experience America was designed to really educate the diplomatic corps. It's a big piece of the chief of protocol's office. We have to make sure that we credential the foreign diplomats, and then we make sure that they learn so much more about our great country. It's a big posting, so we want them to really travel around the United States to get to know us. And one of my favorite trips was when we took the ambassadors, and there were something like 60 plus their spouses, was to Atlanta. And this was the occasion that I first really got to meet Mr. Clyde Tuggle, who was the Coca-Cola representative and hosted a phenomenal dinner for the ambassadors there. we learned that that visit meant so much to the diplomatic corps. While we were there, what we focused on was not only the beauty of Atlanta and the business and innovation side of Atlanta, because certainly there's so much to brag about from that fine, fine city. Of course, going to Coca-Cola itself. But we also talked about some of the underlying issues, the racial tensions in our country and our history. We had the great John Lewis, who was there talking about his struggles, and that was just so inspirational. And I think of him now, of course, today so much more fondly, and the fact that I had that experience with him. But what it drew out in the diplomatic corps was even more fascinating. The ambassador of South Africa talked about his time locked up in a jail cell that was close to Nelson Mandela. The ambassador of Kosovo talked about being jailed as well for his views on his journalistic perspective. All of them were having this really collaborative experience and sharing their stories and saying that they were able to move forward in their country based upon our struggles in the United States and how people like John Lewis had inspired them to move forward. It was an extraordinary conversation that took place at the Martin Luther King Memorial there, the library there. And I just will forever remember this visit to Atlanta and how important it was in bringing these diplomats together and for them to understand our great American people, and especially those from Atlanta.
I'm glad you brought him to Atlanta. I mean, Atlanta has this unique history, unique moral history that both good and ill that we have to deal with. And I think it facilitates discussions like that. I've got Jim Reed, who's one of my board members, so I want to ask his question, and it asks, and I know he works for a Japanese company. Is there a culture that is particularly challenging for American leaders to navigate? And secondly, can you talk for a moment about pronouncing place names and people's names correctly when you're engaged in commercial or international diplomacy, political diplomacy?
Well, let me start with the second first, is that my name, not easy. So many people struggle with it. And so we went through, of course, having pronunciations for the president again and again. I actually would tape me saying it so that he could hear it again and again and send him that recording so that they can hear over and over again. And I, of course, would also have someone from the embassy making sure that they were pronouncing it correctly for me. But name pronunciation is so important. It's someone's identity, their country, same thing, their identity. You want to make sure that you get that right. It can be that slight that just kind of never goes away. So putting in that extra effort, making sure that you are pronouncing names appropriately is certainly worth the time and worth the investment. On a culture, I think that it's probably more in line with women. It would be in the Middle East. They're just not quite sure sometimes what is expected of them. And I found, again, doing the research, doing the homework, going to our U.S. Embassy and asking what is expected of me when I travel to X country. Am I to cover my head? Am I not to cover my head? When I'm meeting certain people in business meetings, do those rules change? Versus when I am engaging in a cultural excursion. You know, how am I to apply that? And also it's applied very differently, in particularly in the Middle East, from country to country. And so knowing those cultural differences in advance is really important, and again, can help you move yourself forward in that relationship.
There are a lot of traps out there. What size business? I mean, how does a business get that information? I mean, are there consultants? Are there protocol? I mean, there are people who do this for a living that a business can contract and tell them before you go to make your pitch in Vietnam, you need to do these things?
Well, you can first off read my book.
Yes.
That will be a great manual for anyone. And Global Engagement Strategies, my company, I do just that. As Clyde had pointed out, I help them at Coca-Cola, and I have a roster of other companies that I provide that advice for, because CEOs are ambassadors around the world. They're so great for the United States. They can they can move a relationship forward for us. They can solidify some of these relationships and the engagements that they're having. And we certainly want them to be as equipped as our president is when he travels around the United States. So it really is important for them to have these lessons in advance and to execute them appropriately when they are in other countries.
That's great. We've exhausted our time. But haven't exhausted the questions. There's loads of them that unfortunately we're unable to get to. Some having to do with particular politics. Some of them have to do with being a Croatian American. Some of them dealing with all kinds of things. But I want to thank you so much, Capricia Marshall, the author of Protocol: The Power of Diplomacy and How to Make It Work for You, a book that I assume you can buy online or at your neighborhood bookstore. If you've liked today's program, now's the time to join the World Affairs Council, either as an individual or as a corporate member. On Thursday, we have a fabulous program coming up with Michael Reed, who's a senior editor of The Economist magazine. It's on Brazil and Mexico failing on COVID-19. Michael Reed wrote the book that you used in graduate school. So this is going to be tremendous. And we're going to start out talking about Brazil and Mexico and COVID, but it's open after that. So please join. It's going to be a great conversation. That's Thursday at noon. Next week on July 29th, we have a different kind of Secretary of State. This is the Secretary of State of Georgia, Brad Raffensperger. And the topic is going to be making the November general election a success. As you probably know, it's the Secretary of State who runs the election at the state level. So please join us on July 29th. I want to thank you, the members of the World Affairs Council, and particularly Fernanda Lucchine, the Executive Director, Valerin Lopez de Frank, our Business Manager, and Darian Gillette, the producer. And thank you again, Capricia. Again, everybody, don't forget to buy Protocol: The Power of Diplomacy and How to Make It Work for You. Thank you. Thanks, Clyde.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Capricia.
Thank you.
Capricia, thank you so much.